Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 177. And I have with me Stephen Hicks, who has been a longtime professor of philosophy at, I believe, Rockford College. He's also been involved with Rockford University, and he's also been involved with the Institute for Objectivist Studies, Objectivist Center, Atlas Society for almost from day one as well. So it's the Atlas Society now, but yes. How are you, Stephen?
Doing nicely. Spring has come to the north, so we are happy.
Yes, I wanted to start out. How did you get into Ayn Rand and become an objectivist?
Well, let's see. To try to do the short story. I think the short story is that I came across Atlas Shrugged on my parents' bookshelf when I was a young teenager, and I read a lot of books. I remember asking my mom about this book because I liked big books, and she said, "Well, that's a really good book, but probably wait a few years before you read it." I think I was 13 or something at the time, so I just filed the name away. Some years later, I had graduated from high school. I took a year off to work and travel, so I'd saved up my money, and I was going to go to Europe for the first time. And we got to Toronto Airport. My parents were dropping me off, and my dad at Toronto Airport asked, "Well, do you have a book for the plane? It's a long flight." And I said, "No, I didn't. I was trying to travel light." So we went to the airport bookstore, and I found Ayn Rand. I said, "Oh yeah, that's the name I remember." So I picked up the Fountainhead as trip reading, and ended up reading it several times over the course of my travels around in Europe, which was great. And then when I came back, I started university in the fall semester, and at that point, from the Fountainhead, I was reading my way through Rand's works and taking courses in philosophy, political theory, literature, and so on. So I would say probably freshman year of university was the year that it all came together. And I said, okay, this is philosophy. I really like philosophy, and I had a sense for Rand's views as a whole. I really like that. So that's when I decided I would become a philosophy major. And I don't know if I would be calling myself an objectivist because I was still a kid learning lots and lots of stuff, but it seemed like one of the best things going at the time.
That was at the University of Waterloo, right?
No, I had a lot of friends who went to the University of Waterloo, which was kind of math and computer science. And I was at the University of Guelph, which is about 10 miles away, which was more noted for biological sciences.
But there were a lot of people, objectivists, who came out of that group.
Yeah, there was something going on in southern Ontario. I don't know what it was, but yes, there were several of us at Guelph, several at Waterloo, probably a larger group at Waterloo. And then these are universities just outside of Toronto, so there was a big confluence in Toronto, probably for 2 generations. So yes, if you want to be silly and say there was something in the water, maybe so, yeah. But I think probably more serious was that back in I want to say the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Ontario education system was very good. It was kind of a traditional but open and serious, not authoritarian, not libertine education system. So I think there was a large number of smart young people. And of course, Canada was prosperous and free. So for whatever reason, a lot of people were attracted to objectivism out of Ontario.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah. So anyway, so what is, I've noticed there's a growing, among libertarian, at least I call it a problem among libertarians who want to blame the Enlightenment for wokeism. What's your response to that?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, most of my academic work has been focused on the left, and then more recently on the right. So the conservative right, and of course those are big tent labels, and the left. So I'm more familiar with the leftist critique of the Enlightenment, coming out of particularly Frankfurt School, critical theory, some of the neo-Marxists, and of course the postmoderns. And then more recently, the conservative right, another big tent, but it's going through a fracture. And part of it is, I don't mean this to be too flip, but the conservative right is trying to get back in the intellectual game since they've been largely shut out of universities and some of the other institutions of high culture. And they are dismayed by the postmodern left and wokeism, but they also are not fans of the Enlightenment. So I'm more familiar with those two approaches. I'm not actually too familiar with libertarians who are critical of the Enlightenment, probably because I read less in that area. So that's all I can say at this point, unless you want to come back and give me an example or one of the arguments that's used.
It seemed, well, it definitely comes more from what I would call the Mises Institute libertarians. I don't know. I think there's also more and more who are saying now that there's an attitude that reason is still based on Christianity, and it's like you could only have liberalism when you have a Christian foundation. It's
okay.
In
that case, there's going to be some crossover with the what I think of as the national conservative movement or integralist movements. And some of those, of course, are trying to blame the Enlightenment for various things. Some of them, and here we have to, I think, start getting nuancy. And it may be that coming out of the Mises Institute, which I can't say that I followed recently, but I know I did read some of the materials some years ago, and crossover there with paleo conservatives. So in that case, with that hand waving right going on, there's two kinds of critiques there. One is to say that the modern world has been a disaster. So what these kinds of conservatives or paleo types will do is say that the Enlightenment was irreligious and that it was rational, it was individualistic, and that both of those undermine a faith or a traditional belief in an established way of doing things that seems to work pretty well. So by being rational, one is too critical, and you cannot be a believer in religion or in the traditional belief systems. If you are too individualistic on this view, then you're not going to be a social person. You might even be an antisocial person. Or if you're going to be individualistic, that means that indulging your whims and just doing whatever you feel like. And so out of that very general approach, you will then say everything that is happening now that is bad in modern society comes out of the Enlightenment. So what we need to do then is reassert an old style conservatism and go back to traditional religion, which is either based on personal faith or based on tradition. But people have established rules and established moral principles, and that we're all going to accept those moral principles, and that those require that we not be too rational about them or that we be too individualistic about them. So that's one approach. Now, the other approach, though, is a kind of conservatism that still wants to blame the Enlightenment for our woes, as they see it in contemporary society. But they will argue that the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, that we can't go back to the olden days. There's no way to do that. And at the same time, they are open enough to say that the Enlightenment has some achievements under its belt. So it has been relatively peaceful. It has generated enormous amounts of prosperity. So what they will do is segment out the good parts from the Enlightenment from the bad parts of the Enlightenment and argue that what we should do is marry the good parts of the Enlightenment with a more conservative, traditionalist, and perhaps faith-based religious approach. So that's the critique. My response to all of that is to say that that misdiagnoses our current woes. what we have, whichever pathological movements you think are going on right now, perhaps the radical Islam movement that has caught fire, and so many college students and others are outright celebrating terrorists and rapes and old-fashioned anti-Semitism and so on. There is no way, for example, to say that that came out of the Enlightenment and people being too rational or being too individualistic. So that particular pathology is a resurgence of kind of just old style pathological religion. It's going back to pre-modernism. So what we need is more enlightenment rather than less enlightenment to go after that particular group. If it is people who are not to say to recognize that transgenderism is a legitimate issue and that there's a lot of biological and psychological and psychosociological things that need to be worked out there. But then those who want to take the transgenderism to the point of kind of denying biology and engaging in a forceful assertion of kind of just a personal irrationalism. There again there's no way to say that that comes out of being people being too enamored of Enlightenment science and technology and respecting individual rights, because from the get-go, that particular group is not respecting any of that. And then more principally, or more strategically, rather, I would say that there's also the postmodern movement that comes out of the leftism, which is explicitly anti-realistic, anti-Enlightenment from the get-go. They are anti-rational, they are anti-individualistic, and that they are also largely responsible for a significant number of the pathologies in contemporary society, but that conservatives kind of misdiagnose when they try to say that somehow postmodernism and its offshoots come out of the Enlightenment. Rather, what we have is kind of a traditional conservatism. We have a modern Enlightenment liberal individualism that's rationalistic, and there's a completely different third contender, the postmodern approach, and that if you're going to diagnose how we got to where we are, a simple Enlightenment and Enlightenment leading to bad things, and therefore we need to go back to conservatism, that's much too reductionistic. There's at least three major contenders, not just those two.
Yeah, that's an interesting, but I do wonder where, I'm thinking about where we might have went wrong, because we had the Enlightenment, but somehow this, got to Rousseau, and then it got to Kant, and it got to Hegel. And what do you think about them? I mean, what was their impact? How do we get from the Enlightenment to
Well,
that?
yeah, that's a very important question and huge. So the Enlightenment is typically dated from the long 1700s. So we might say, if we go back to John Locke, Isaac Newton, those are towering individuals at the beginning of the Enlightenment. And they are doing their major publishing in the latter part of the 1680s, and then their impact is felt significantly by 1700, and their ideas are largely institutionalized in the 1700s. So there what you have is a robust science and a scientific method, including the mathematical tools and then the empirical tools that Francis Bacon and others had pointed us toward. You have the emphasis on reason and individualism and tolerance and limited government, all of that coming out of Locke. And so the 1700s is when those abstract scientific and philosophical ideas are then institutionalized in all segments of society. So widespread religious toleration comes along. We start to recognize the modern sciences, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology a little later, the application of those, the inventiveness and the Industrial Revolution, religious toleration, the idea of the universal rights of man, but then very quickly, what we would call early feminist tracks saying that we should extend those rights equally to women, those same liberty rights. The first anti-slavery movements coming into existence, when the first time in human history, large numbers of people in the 1700s are saying there's something wrong with slavery and we should do something about that. So, and then of course the beginnings of free market economics. Now all of that is the 1700s. You put it all together, we have the Enlightenment. Now, the conservatives of the time didn't like it. They thought, oh my goodness, we're attacking religion, we're attacking religion, traditional morality. The slaves are getting uppity. Women don't know their place anymore. People are questioning religion, and young people want to choose their own spouses rather than letting things be married. And the feudal system is being all broken down, and kings are being deposed, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a disaster. And so the conservatives of that time are saying we need to stop all of this and go back to the good old days, as they characterize it. But at the same time, there was another counter Enlightenment movement that was beginning in the middle part of the 1700s that said, we don't like this new modern Enlightenment direction. We think it's problematic, or it might be fundamentally flawed, but at the same time, we cannot go back to the olden days. So we might not like modernity, but we're not going to be pre-modern. And so what we need to do is critique in a fundamental way what these Enlightenment thinkers and Enlightenment activists are all about, but we're going to take modernity in a different direction. And so the gentleman you mentioned, Rousseau, although calling him a gentleman is a bit ironic because he he despised the gentleman. But then Kant, we should probably throw David Hume in the mix there as well. And then in the next generation, Hegel. So Rousseau in the middle part of the 1700s, Kant toward the end of the 1700s, Hegel in the early part of the 1800s, and then the story will continue with Marx in the middle part of the 1800s, Nietzsche at the end of the 1800s, and so on into the 20th century. And what all of these guys represent is a new, significant, deep philosophical attack on various aspects of the Enlightenment that gathered increasing force as time moved on and we got into the 20th century. So that's the overview. But so then if we want to say just a few things about each of these individuals specifically. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, if you say, well, the Enlightenment stands for being rational. Rousseau wants to argue fundamentally that we are not rational beings. We are passional beings. And the problems that human beings have is when they start thinking too much, because then they get critical and they start thinking about themselves. And then that means that they start comparing themselves to other, and some people wanting to be better than other people. And that leads us away from a more natural equality that all humans should be sharing. So Rousseau is explicitly anti-rational. He's also explicitly anti-individualistic, the idea that we should say individuals have these inalienable rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Well, Rousseau is opposed to all of those things. We should not be free individuals. Maybe we are born free, but everybody is going to be in chains, and the proper system is going to justify a new modern kind of chains, so to speak. So he has this notion of a more collective, semi-organic, tribal understanding of what it is to be a human being, and that is what we should be striving for in the modern world. Rousseau was opposed to the free speech and the freedom of the press that the Enlightenment was developing. He was opposed to the separation of church and state that the Enlightenment was developing. He thought that religion was an essential tool of politics, and that even to the point where people who disagreed with, particularly if they disagreed publicly with the state established religion, those people could be put to death. Now, this guy is not an old-fashioned religious conservative. He is a modern thinker, but he's anti-Enlightenment and he wants to take the world in a different direction, and he's been enormously influential. So I'm going to pause there just at a moment to give you a moment to kick back, because that's a lot that I put out there. So that's just to say, though, that right at the height of the Enlightenment, there was a significant counter-Enlightenment that was developing, and that's why those guys are important.
Yeah, it's a very it's very interesting because, of course, that's because a lot of people saw similarities between the French Revolution, but maybe because of Rousseau, that's why the French Revolution ended up going to the Reign of Terror.
Well, yes. Let me just say just a couple of 1 minute's worth of stuff on the French Revolution. I think we need some nuance here. We're going to talk about the French Revolution. We have to talk about three revolutions that occurred that came from radically different sections of the society. So the French Revolution was initially inaugurated by the aristocrats, who recognized that there was a weak monarchy and that France was having economic difficulties. And so they saw a chance for themselves to get more power back from the monarchy. So these were not people who were, in favor of a revolution, a modern revolution. It was just old style feudal politics. But nonetheless, they forced a calling of all of the different estates or the different classes in French society for a national meeting, and they succeeded in weakening the king, garnering some significant concessions. Now, it is important that this was happening at the height of the Enlightenment, and specifically the French Enlightenment. And so there were lots and lots of people who were also Enlightenment liberals. So the second phase was that once the cat was out of the bag, so to speak, people we would recognize as more modern Enlightenment liberals, people like Condorcet and the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought with the American revolutionaries and who was a great admirer. Those were the ones who then came to power. And out of that, we have a pretty much ideologically revolution for a couple of years. It's very similar to, in beliefs, to the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Man and Citizen. That in the French, they're very similar. But yes, there's a third phase, and here is when Robespierre and Danton and Saint-Just and the others succeed in taking over the revolution, or hijacking it, if you want to call it. And they were all disciples, explicitly disciples of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, anti-Lockean, anti-Enlightenment. And so they were much more collectivist, much more authoritarian. And in that third phase, everything that did go to hell, so to speak, in the reign of terror. So yes.
Those liberals probably also would have included Montesquieu, right?
Yes. Yeah, although Montesquieu was writing earlier and he was not active right during the revolution, but yes, he was certainly an important intellectual influence. So Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, all of those giant names from the middle part of the 1700s.
Yeah, Voltaire, yes, of course. So that's how we got to the French Revolution. But then, of course, later we got Basquiat too. So that was a
It's not to say that the aristocrats went away, or that the Enlightenment liberals went away. But again, what you have in France is a three-way, right, between the let's go back to the good old days. No, let's go forward in an Enlightenment liberal direction, and let's go forward, but in a more collectivist authoritarian direction.
Yeah. What do you think makes the Enlightenment necessary to a free society?
Well, if you go to the fundamentals of the Enlightenment, it did see itself as enlightened. They asked the question, as the Enlightenment philosophers started to ask, why have human beings been so poor and so miserable for as long as there have been human beings, with a few short-lived times in across history? You might say, some of the Egyptians achieved some great things, some Greeks achieved some even greater things, and the Romans achieved some greater things. And you might look back to the Renaissance, what was happening in Florence and Venice and so on, and say, okay, but those are very short episodes of perhaps a couple of 100 years each in a long span of darkness and ignorance and superstition and poverty and short lives. But suddenly, and this is a suddenly in the span of human history, just within a century or so, we in the 18th century or the long 1700s, we've started to do science. We've started to recognize the rights of individuals. And so we have become Enlightenment, and we've started to see the effects of this new philosophy coming from Francis Bacon and John Locke and Isaac Newton and others on improving the standard of living of human beings and getting past the religious hatreds and getting past the shorter life expectancies, which were already starting to rise. And so we have then not only an identification of the importance of reason, the fundamental importance of reason, the fundamental value of the individual, working out scientific method to actually experimentally and mathematically to figure out how the world really works, to get past all of those superstitions. We have unlocked some of the not only the secrets of the universe, but the ways to figure out more and get more of the secrets of the universe. So we are, for the first time in human history, living in an age of enlightenment. Not that everybody is enlightenment, but or enlightened rather, but we are making progress. It's also an era of optimism. And I want to say, aside from the commitment to reason and individualism and liberalism and universal equality of rights and toleration, the idea of being optimistic about one's own life, about society, the idea that we can solve problems and we should be able to make the world a better place. That also is a very unusual view for human beings to have. And it being not only, I would say, discovered is a bit strong, but institutionalized in wide segments of society in the Enlightenment is another achievement of the Enlightenment. If you think about how most humans through most of history thought about their circumstances, if they started to think big picture, they would typically say, well, the way history goes is there were the good old days. We used to live in pristine nature and everything was wonderful, or we lived in the Garden of Eden. But history is the story of things getting worse and worse and worse and worse across time. And the expectation is that our generation is just going to continue to make things worse until things get really bad and perhaps we will all die. So you understand your own life as a story of decline. You understand your society as a story of decline. You understand human history as a story of decline. And that has huge effects on you psychologically and socially, what your expectations are for your life and your society. Or the other common view across almost all of history was to say, well, that might be too pessimistic. But really, though, what happens is, because sometimes things do get a little bit better, but that's largely a matter of luck for certain individuals, or maybe certain societies just get lucky for a little while. But really, everything is just going to go back to kind of the historical mean. And so you have a cyclical view of history. That, well, things will get a little better for a while, but then they'll get worse for a while, then they'll get better for a while, then they'll get worse for a while, right? And so on forever. And that then also affects how you think about your life individually and socially. So this new view that became championed and widespread during the Enlightenment, that no, there is no problem that human beings, using their reason, using their individual initiative, working out new forms of teamwork and working together, there's no problem that we can't figure out and find some way to improve. I can make my life better. I can make my life better for my family. We can make government better. We can make religion better. We can make the world a better place. And that is a hugely important, but often implicit psychological and social belief that is hugely important from the Enlightenment. And no matter how cynical and jaded we are in the early 21st century, where we are now, I think most of us still retain some element of that.
Yeah, I mean the optimism, and of course, if you look at history, I can suspect that, for example, the average life expectancy was probably stagnant, but then at one point it starts to go up, and
from kind of a world average in the 20s, right, to in the more successful nations, a world average in the 30s. And that's where things were in the 1700s, before the Industrial Revolution, before the abolishment of slavery, before political liberalism, before free markets, before science. And then within a century or so, that doubled to being in the 60s, and now it's in the high 70s, and in some places flirting with the 80s.
Well, and maybe more significant things like the invention of the microscope and other things that were used in medicine.
Oh yeah. Yeah, microscopes, yes, and then mass production of medicines and all sorts of medical tools that can be mass produced and made out of steel and stainless steel. So a lot of the hygiene issues and the mass production of antiseptics, all of which had to be discovered and produced and so on. So yes, science and invention working with capitalism to remake modern medicine. That's a hugely wonderful story.
Yeah. So what do you think we can do to get reason and freedom back into academia? I mean, as we speak, there's these large encampments on Columbia and Yale and other universities. And it's just like, what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, so let's then to go for more broadly from society or kind of Western culture or now increasingly global culture, where the Enlightenment has been a huge success. And I think it still is a huge success, then to start focusing more narrowly on one important cultural institution, the academic world. And the academic world, again, we'll start parsing things out a little more here, is certainly suffering from some grievous intellectual and moral diseases right now. That's not to say, though, that there aren't still many academic institutions and parts of many academic institutions that are doing wonderful, wonderful things. So if we start with the nuance, we say, you take your standard university and divide things into the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the professional schools like business, medicine, education, and so forth. By and large, things are pretty healthy in the natural sciences. Yes, the postmoderns are going after the sciences, they're going after math, they're making their impact felt there. But by and large, there's wonderful, wonderful stuff constantly happening in this amazing academic edifice that we call university sciences and associated research institutions right now. Social sciences more mixed, humanities a worse case. So if I wanted to, though, say where the problems come, the encampments where you have people who are explicitly hostile to liberty, to equal rights, to tolerance, to civil discourse. And then as they scale out, we hate the idea of liberal education, where we have to listen to actual divergent opinions and debate things and read people with whom we disagree with and cultivate the informed critical responses to them. If we have large numbers of individuals, students, graduate students, and professors who are explicitly irrational, anti-individualistic, uncivil, willing to punch people in the face over disagreements, who want to shut people down, and those are a significant number of people in universities, well, that's an embarrassment for those of us who are in higher education. But it's also a point of shame. And the point is, the question that you're quietly asking is, where does that come from? Well, it does not come from the Enlightenment liberals. The Enlightenment liberals are the ones who created the vast, successful university edifice, college and university edifice of the 1900s and the 20th century. It did not come from the conservatives, because the conservatives have been largely shut out of higher education for most of the 20th century, and increasingly so during the early part of the 21st century. So what you're left with is the other important movement, and that is to say, in high philosophical terms, the postmodern movement, right? Those who, on my analysis, are coming out of the counter-enlightenment or the anti-enlightenment, and they have been the most successful at colonizing themselves inside higher education, particularly since the 1960s, increasingly so in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And by the time we get to the 1990s, they were, particularly in the humanities and related fields, largely institutionalized. They were a majority. And what always happens when you have a majority of power-based ideological people in any institution is that they immediately then want to remake the entire institution in their own way and shut out all of the countervailing voices. That started to happen in a leveraged fashion in the 90s on into the early part of the 20th century. And then what you find is by the time we get into the 20-teens, it all starts to burst out in ugly form. And that's when, political correctness and then quickly relabeled wokeism to try to capture the many various forms of applied postmodernism that are going on. Suddenly, it's not only that people inside the academic world are saying, hey, something is terribly wrong inside the academic world, but people who are outside of the academic world are suddenly aware something is very sickly and diseased and unhealthy in the academic world. And that's where we've been for the last 10 years now. So the answer to your question is to say that it's the counter-Enlightenment, but in more recent form, it's postmodernism. Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Stanley Fish, and others. And then that high theory is taken over by a generation of professors who are more activists, and then graduate students and students who very quickly learn what the new game is, and they are trying to take over campuses and get rid of all of the liberal education elements.
Yeah, and again, there are differences because Marx is not popular with economics professors at all.
Yes, no, that's right. So if we go back out of the humanities and we go into the social sciences, economics is typically one of the social sciences, and it's been a relatively successful social science. But yes, Marxism, basically, it had its day in the late 1800s, and the economics profession paid some attention to it. But due to the marginalists and other early economists and other what we now call neoclassical economists, Marxism was seen as just one more failed economic theory, and economics did not particularly pay attention to it, and still is not paying particularly much attention to it for the last 140 years or so.
Yeah. What's the difference between humanities and social sciences?
Well, the humanities, that's an important question. So let me just say what we typically call the humanities. So inside the academic world, we'll organize fields of study according to what their subject matter is. So if we're doing the natural sciences, then we are studying physics and chemistry and biology, and humans will be in the mix, but we're not focusing our attention on humans. We're studying geology and astronomy and gravity and so on, independently of or subset applications to human beings. So the way nature works in general. If we are interested primarily in human beings, but we think that we have an area of human activity that is amenable to scientific methods of running experiments, doing data analysis, including mathematics, statistics, and so forth. And so economics is a category here. Or we are trying to study human beings scientifically, the way anthropologists will, by gathering the data and noticing similarities and differences, or to try to come up with laws of human interaction, noticing similar family structures and population rates and so on, as sociologists say try to do. Or if we think that we can study history and draw some general laws or general principles about how human behavior acts across time, then we will say we are studying humans, but scientifically. And so those are typically the social sciences. Now, what's left over is going to be those areas where we're interested in human beings, but we're not yet at the stage, or we don't think we will ever get to the stage, depending on our philosophy, of thinking that we can study these things scientifically. So we're interested in human beings and their religions, or we're interested in human beings and their poetic aspirations, or we're interested in human beings and their artistic creations and their theatrical creations, or the literatures that they created. So art departments, English literature department, world literature departments, religion departments, and so on, those are typically collected in an area, and we call that just the humanities. And we're studying human beings front and center. So that's the categorization part of your question.
Okay, so psychology would be a social science, but not humanities?
Yeah, that was all of these things are argued about, right? So if you take psychology, another one is politics. Do we say that politics is a study that is too irrational and not really amenable to scientific study because it's ideological or whatever? Then you will call your department the Department of Politics. Others will say, no, 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 we can do political studies empirically and scientifically, so we're going to call it political science. But that's an argument that's undergoing. The same thing has happened in psychology over the course of the 20th century. So the human psyche, now that's an important part of human beings. And we are interested in human beings. And so in the early days, psychology would be part of the human being. But as this started to happen right around 1900 or so, where some psychologists imbued with the scientific spirit said, no, no, we can understand the human being as part of nature. And as a part of nature, whatever's going on in the psyche should be obeying natural laws. And so psychology should be able to figure out what those natural laws are. So, for example, I choose 1900. That can be symbolically significant because Sigmund Freud published his first major work, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1900. And Freud was a kind of a reductive materialist. He's the first generation of evolutionary theory. And so basically, he says human beings have evolved as part of nature. We have a brain that is evolved of a certain sort, but we are animals, and animals are instinct driven. And so, what Freud wants to argue is that we should understand the human being, including its psychology, as driven by brain and body based instincts. So, the instinct for aggression, the instinct for sexuality. And I, Sigmund Freud, can explain everything that's going on in human psychology in terms of these two underlying instincts, which are biological in origin. So, at that point, many psychologists wanted to say we should start doing psychology as a science. Now, there was, of course, pushback, not only criticisms about Freud, but those who wanted to say, no, 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 we should not understand the human psyche in such reductionist terms. We still have a spirit, or we have a soul, or we have something that cannot be captured in materialistic or naturalistic terms. So, and we are free agents. So psychology can never be a science. So that's been one of the big debates over the course of the 20th century, whether psychology is properly part of the humanities or whether it is a social science.
Yeah, those are great questions, great things to think about. And do you think we didn't mention, but how do you think the Frankfurt School played a part in all this?
Yeah, okay, interesting. So, well, there is a connection because they were influenced by Freud. So we can just mention that and put that to the side for a moment. So by the Frankfurt School, we mean a number of thinkers who are based initially in Frankfurt, Germany, in the 1930s, when a lot of them, as with many other people, were driven out or chose to leave Central Europe and Germany, especially in the 1930s, because of the rise of Nazism. The school, as it developed, came to be called critical theory, but it has its roots in the Frankfurt School. And the names that are most specifically mentioned here are Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and then in the next generation, more like a half a generation, people like Herbert Marcuse, and all of whom were extraordinarily influential on sociology, political theory, strategizing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Now, why are they important? Well, they're important because all of them are Marxists as young men. And all of them started off more or less as true believer classical Marxists. But they were smart guys and they were open minded enough to recognize that classical Marxist theory, by the time we get to the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, just doesn't work. So Marx was, of course, claiming that his philosophy was a social science, that economics was the driver of the world, class analysis, class conflict analysis, exploitation, oppression, capitalism bad, some sort of violent revolution is necessary to bring the communist revolution, all of that. So take all of that, put it in a box, call that classical Marxism. Now, all of this, though, was argued for by Marx and a little by Engels as well in the 1840s, on into the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. Marx dies, then a little later, Engels dies. And if this is a scientific theory, then what that means is we have a theory and we make predictions about how society is going to go. And so we are committed to those predictions being put to the test of experiential practice. By the time you get to the 1930s, it's almost 100 years. And then the 1940s, the 1950s, it's over 100 years of Marxist theory making predictions, and almost all, without fail, of those predictions failing, and failing terribly. So what you have then is after World War I, things calmed down in the 1930s. In the 1920s, but in the 1930s, you've got the rise of Nazism, you've had the rise of fascism in Italy, and the Marxists are thinking and trying to rethink. I'll put it bluntly, what the hell are we going to do with Marxism if in our heart of hearts we think Marx was great, wonderful, visionary, but the predictions just aren't happening? Capitalism has not died off. Fascism, and despite there being similarities between Marxism and fascism, the Marxists hate the fascists as well. And once again, capitalism seems to be doing pretty well, and the fascists are on the rise. So what are we going to do with this Marxist theory? So what they do is they say we have to revise, and perhaps revise significantly, something in Marxist theory. And the question is, what is that? Now, what most of them are going to do is to say, we are going to say that Marx was too narrowly focused on economics. And so this is the first major move inside the Frankfurt School, to say that Marx reduced everything to economics. People are divided into economic groups. Those economic groups are in conflict with each other. Some become strong and start to exploit and oppress the others. And part of the oppression is rewriting the laws to benefit themselves at the expense of the other groups. But eventually, everything is going to get worse and worse and worse, and we'll have a revolution. What the early Frankfurt School thinkers are doing is to say that it's not necessarily economics that is fundamental, that there are other dimensions of social conflict that are not necessarily reducible to economics. There are family structures, there are political structures, there are religious structures, there are sociological structures of various sorts, and there also are psychological structures as well. And so what we need to do is have not a monomaniacal focus on reducing everything to economics, but see society as multidimensional, and that all of these conflicts and different classes conflicting with each other, and the relationships of strong versus weak and oppression, are then multidimensional. And so it's not just that we have to fight capitalism as the Marxists want to fight it. We also have to fight certain religious structures, and certain political structures, and certain relationships between the races, and certain relationships between the sexes. And so what the Frankfurt School then is arguing is that we will be neo-Marxist. That is to say, we'll retain this idea that people are born into groups, they are conditioned by those groups are in conflict with each other, it's strong group versus weak group, the strong groups oppress it. We'll keep all of that part of Marxism, but we're going to have to start splintering into different sub-schools, where we say, we think the important group is males dominating females. And so you will have Marxist feminists, and they will be coming out of the one version of the Frankfurt School. Or we will say it is this religion oppressing this religion, or this ethnic group oppressing this ethnic group, or it is this race oppressing this other race. And so you take the Marxist template, but generalize it, and therefore we need to have a more robust, multidimensional social science. And that is what the Frankfurt School inaugurates. So they've been enormously successful over the course of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and to this day. And so what we now call identity politics, for example, is a grandchild of this kind of critical theory.
Yeah, and it's interesting that when the Frankfurt School came to America, they set up shop at Columbia.
Well, and the New School for Social Research and various other places. It is interesting that this is it's a cheap shot, but one that has a point, that you have a large number of people, all of these Frankfurt School people, who are in Germany and Austria and other parts of Eastern Europe, but the most famous ones are in Germany. They hate the United States, they hate Britain, they hate the capitalist West. But when they decide to get out of Germany, despite the fact that they are all Marxists and neo-Marxists of a sort, none of them decide to go to the Soviet Union in order to get out of bad stuff in Germany. They did all go to the capitalist West. So I think that says something about people marching with their feet and what their true beliefs are.
That does say something, because if you go back 15 or 20 years earlier, they did go to the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's right.
Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman went to the Soviet Union, and to her credit, Emma Goldman was disillusioned almost immediately.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, a large number of true believer Westerners, right? True believers in Marxism who made the pilgrimage, right? And some of them came back and just rewrote the propaganda, but some of them, as you said, had their brains were still working, and they became disillusioned. So the Frankfurt School are semi-disillusioned Marxists, but of an academic bent, and so their job is to revise the theory in ways that accommodates the new evidence, but in a way that carries on the fight against capitalism.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot more similarity. I think Emma Goldman and Ayn Rand had a lot more in common than people admit. I think they would have had some very interesting conversations if they'd gotten together.
Well, there's some papers worth writing there.
Yeah. Well, they're both Russians who came to America, and just similar background. Although Goldman's older, but yeah. Sure. So, and you mentioned Marcuse, and also, and that was, and of course we can also talk about some of the Austrian economists who ended up at NYU. So,
well, yes, that's right. Aside from all of the neo-Marxists who are getting out of Central Europe, this is a much happier story to say that there are lots of people like Karl Popper and Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and others who got out of Austria and came to the West to the West's benefit.
Yes, the West did benefit from that. It was quite amazing. Something I've noticed, and maybe because of what's happened during the last few years, if people don't believe in God, is there maybe a temptation to try to play God? And maybe I think we can do great things, but it's almost like sometimes people do want to go so far as to think that they almost can play God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say to the most general part of your question, I want to say no.
Yeah.
Just because not believing in God, I think, predicts absolutely nothing positive about what you will believe in. To say that you don't believe in God just is to say you don't have one particular belief in your intellectual furniture. And so that leaves entirely open the question of what you think humans are capable of, and the kind of world that they're living in, and to what extent the world is open or not to human design. So you will have some humans who will carry over a traditional religious belief, who will say, God knows everything and human beings are ignorant. And so that person, if that person comes to disbelieve in a God, will just remain in the point of saying, well, human beings are ignorant and we're just stuck. Others might have a traditional belief in God, but believe that human beings were made in the image of God, including God's intellectual powers. And so if I don't believe that there's actually a God, but that was just some sort of a projection of what we think of ourselves onto a mythic being, but we don't believe in that mythic being, then I'm going to be left with the idea that humans do have pretty amazing intellectual powers. So already you've got a very wide range of opinion among people who no longer believe in God. And there are other
True.
philosophical issues that will come along.
I guess it's sometimes our attempts to. It seems like a lot of our attempts to remake the world have ended up making things worse. And I guess it's a question of how do you try to be a
Yes,
reformer?
and that's it takes us back to an earlier question about one of the conservative and postmodern leftist critiques of the
Mhm.
Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is very proud of its accomplishment and very admiring of human potential, especially the human potential for reason. So to go from saying human beings are very smart and there's kind of no problem that we can't figure out the answer to given enough time and dedication to thinking that one can get there very quickly and to thinking that there's no problem in particular that can't be solved to believing that I now have the answer to all problems. So hasty concluding and overstating human abilities is certainly going to be an
Right.
occupational hazard for Enlightenment thinkers as well. And to be sure, some of them do want to say, and these are individuals who are at least partly imbued with the spirit of the Enlightenment, who will kind of combine that with a kind of a messiah complex, if we can call it that. And I think it's in some cases accurate. That is my personal mission to save the world. And I know that I'm a really smart guy and I've got all of the important answers figured out. And that should also give me the social power to make you do what I think is the right thing. And so we have at least the psychological basis for some forms of modern dictatorialism.
Yeah, because I think there's eventually. I wonder if some people ever get to this point of realizing that there is so much knowledge in this world that there's no way I can possibly learn all of it.
Mm, yes. Yeah, and that's an interesting ongoing project. So,
Yeah.
how much can one know? And I think it's wonderful to have an optimistic sense, particularly when one is young, that
Yeah.
you could set your mind to just about anything and become expert in it. And you can also become a general Renaissance man and Renaissance woman or Renaissance person and come to know a huge amount of stuff about a lot of things. And then with modern technologies that we're wonderfully fortunate to be able to access a whole lot more than smart people of earlier generations. So that natural optimism, and hopefully then as it becomes a cultivated optimism, but nonetheless, one does need to be realistic and to say you only have so much
Yeah.
time and you still are a being who can make mistakes and you do get tired. And sometimes we want to believe in certain things just because it's an idea that we came up with ourselves. And so we have to be aware of all of the potential errors and biases that we are prone to and come up with an accurate assessment of how much you do in fact know.
Yes, that's. I think that's maybe part of it. I think yeah, it's important to be confident, but I think you have to find a sweet spot between confidence and humility,
Yeah.
and
But
that's hard because yeah.
yeah, if a friendly amendment, I don't think quite a humility is the right word there. I think what we're looking for is objectivity.
Okay.
So I think the way I would put it, you and I are both older men now, but if we recall back in our teen years when we were teenagers, there is something wonderful about teenagers who are healthy and vigorous and just have all of that natural vitality and feeling immortal, right? And that's wonderful. But at the same time, there's a place for knowing what your
Yes.
limits are and not being the idiot middle-aged guy who still thinks he can do what he could do when he was 16. So, but at the same time, recognizing that being a middle-aged guy now is not the same as being a middle-aged guy 100 years ago. and being open to the question that maybe in another generation, things are open-endedly progressive.
If you even got to your Middle Ages at all back then, yes. I mean,
well, yeah, good point.
Yeah, it's well, you said you had about an hour. I got to ask, what do you think about Javier Milei, Stephen? I mean, you're Facebook friends with him.
Okay.
You know him.
Yes.
Yeah, I know that
well,
was the reason for
if
the
I
show.
can brag a little bit, my wife runs the Ayn Rand Center of Latin America. She founded
Yes.
it some years ago, and she runs conferences all over Latin America. And so they just put on a big event in Buenos Aires, I think 2 weeks ago now. And yeah, she invited Javier Milei, who came, and they had a wonderful extended interview of about an hour and a half. It's available on YouTube. So that's a little bit of just reflected glory for me in that case. But I think more analytically, what I would say is, as a practical politician, I'm very much in favor of what Milei is doing. I think he's a wonderful chance for Argentina, which ranks high in the recent generations in government corruption, ranks low in economic output. It's one of those places that should be among the richest nations in the world, but is a tragic underperformer. So I think Milei is, as a practical politician, doing very good things and giving Argentina once again the chance that it should have. If I step away from evaluating him as a practical politician, then if we look at what he believes in, then I would give him very high marks on his economic philosophy, because he's been strongly influenced by limited government thinkers, including Ayn Rand in the mix, and then certainly by Austrian and neoclassical economists, so Hayek, Mises, James Buchanan, and the others. And so he's a true believer in all of that economic theory, and that's what he's putting into practice. Now, but also then philosophically, he does have a strong dose of social conservatism. So some of his views on socially conservative issues, he and I would diverge significantly on those. I don't think they're particularly high in his on his agenda, so I worry a little bit less. But we do have to pay attention to those. Of course, there is the other issue, which is in a president, one's personal character and his rise to power. He is very aggressive in his language and in his behavior. Some of that I think is warranted. Some of that I think is a weakness. We all know how these social media and other discussions go. They're not productive, but I think there's a strong dose of that in Milei's character. We might say that's largely or significantly why he was successful in democratic electoral politics. Someone who was willing to be a bit of a beast in the process to take on the other beasts was necessary. But at the same time, in a president, we want someone presidential, someone of strong character. So there's a question mark, I think, over Milei there. I think he does have a strong amount of intellectual honesty and personal integrity, but I do attend to those issues as well.
I also think it almost looks like there is that philosophical re-education happening.
In Argentina, are you asking?
Yeah, that he's changing people's minds. That he's
yes, for certain. Yeah. Well, next month I'm going to be having an online webinar with Atlas Society, and I think I'm going to be paired with Antonella Marti, who's also with the Atlas Society, and she's from Argentina.
And is she distantly related to Maria?
She's quite no family relation there.
Okay.
My wife Maria and Antonella are there, just share a last name, but no relation. Antonella is quite negative on Milei, so that could be an interesting conversation. But the idea is Milei will have been in power then for 5 or 6 months, so it'll be a good time to start assessing not just the theory, but the practical results. But yes, I think one of the important things is what you're suggesting here is that Milei's perhaps most important legacy might not be only the economic and political changes that he's able to introduce, whatever he can get done. We don't know if he will be elected again. He might be one term, he might get two terms, but think of it this way: Milei's role as economic educator, with his huge platform and his huge following, teaching millions and millions and tens of millions of people fundamentals of real economics, that's going to have some staying power. And pairing that, I also like to pair that with, I think, Milei as moral educator, where his honesty is sometimes brutal honesty in saying, we have for generations in Argentina, more broadly in Latin America, actually more broadly in the world, had politicians who are just outright liars and manipulators and corrupt up and down in all of the ways, and exposing the corruptions and saying this is not to be tolerated, and standing up and drawing a line, and not saying that we're just going to do Latin American politics as usual. We are going to be better than that, and giving people an idealistic standard to strive for. And to the extent that he has walked the walk himself, showing that model, I think that also can be hugely important for Argentina and Latin America's future.
Yeah, I think it's really great to see what happens. Yeah, I look forward. I mean, Antonella does make some, bring up some interesting questions. Other people I think are just, people have said to me that it would have went the way of Venezuela if it hadn't been for Milei already. So,
well, anytime you're evaluating any politician, you have to, if you're going to be serious about it, you have to say, look, this guy believes 100 things. That's just to make up a number. You have to be serious about making your list of 100 points, and then figuring out which ones you agree with, which ones you think you disagree with, and then coming up with an overall assessment. And so, it might be that, the guy's 90% good or 60% or 40% good. That is to say, you're doing a rational social scientific analysis of the person. And that's the homework that we all have to do.
I've said it a dozen times already on this show, though. But I said when we both remember when the Berlin Wall came down, we didn't think we'd still be fighting socialists 35 years later.
Yes, no, I think that's an important point, because we beat the fascists in the early part of the 20th century. We beat the Marxist communists in the latter part of the 20th century, and so the modern liberal, using that in the philosophical sense. Western Enlightenment belief in individual rights and free markets and democratic republicanism. We fought two huge wars and won both of them, and we became, I think, complacent for the next generation. And during that generation, the hard left was retooling itself and retooling itself effectively. And it was not until perhaps 20 or 25 years later that we realized once again that we had a big fight on our hands, and that's where we are right now.
Certainly, yeah. I hope it works out. Also Milei is going to be at Freedom Fest, and I've also heard Cato is having a big event down there, and not just Milei, but other big people in his cabinet, and looks like an amazing event. Yeah, and I also looked it up too right now. Flights in June down there are super cheap, but anyway. So it's been great having you on here, Stephen. Where can we
thanks for the invitation, Chris. Yeah, very good questions. I enjoyed the hour very much. Thanks.
Yeah, it was. I wasn't sure if you had more time. You said you only had an hour, so it's
No, I need to make a transition, but yes.
Yeah, it's You're at Rockford University now, so you've always been at Rockford, haven't you? Yeah.
Yeah, except for sabbaticals where I visited various other institutions and some leaves of absence. But yes, this has been my home base for a while.
And you came out of a club of objectivists who ended up doing really well. I mean, it wasn't that also like Susan Don Wake, Don Heath? I mean,
yes, there were quite a few of them. But I don't. Maybe we can do it another time. The reminiscing of old guys reflecting back on the glory days. But yes, it was good times.
Yeah, well, Don was so much responsible for building that organization, though. I mean, people forget his name, but
Don Heath was a wonderful human being.
Well, he did all the work. Answered the phone and went to the post office and wrote the checks.
Sure, yeah. Well, as a chief operating officer does.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Stephen Hicks. So just what's your website?
Just stephenhicks.org.
Okay, yep. Please buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. Thank you, Stephen Hicks. I'm Chris Baker. We're out.